Hi everybody, it's Miss Monet and this is Miss Lizzie, and today we're going to be reading to you a couple of stories. These were a couple of my favorite stories when I was a young kid, and the first is going to be Amelia's Fantastic Flight by Rose Bursik. So, Amelia's Fantastic Flight. Amelia loved airplanes, so she built one. And she took it for a little spin. She breezed through Brazil, and she got a kick out of Kenya. Egypt was entirely enjoyable, and her flight through France was fun. After freezing in Finland, she raced through Russia. Though she found India interesting, she napped in Nepal. She was charmed by China, and Japan was just a joy. Australia was altogether amazing, and she had a terrific time in Tahiti. But she malfunctioned in Mexico. After making a few quick repairs, Amelia hurried back home, and she landed just in time for dinner and a bedtime story. The end. So I definitely recommend this book, you guys. It's Amelia's Fantastic Flight by Rose Bursik. And it is just a really fun book because there are lots of puns in the story, a lot of jokes, and a lot of maps of the world. So if you're interested in geography, this is a wonderful story. So for our next book, we have Only One Woof, which I thought was a good dog book to read with Lizzie. And it's by James Herriot. He writes a lot of great animal stories. Okay. Let's see here. Only One Woof. One nice thing about being a country vet is that there are so many interesting things to see when I visit the farms. One sunny spring day, I visited Mr. Wilkins' farm, and I laughed as I watched the two sheepdog puppies playing together in the farmyard. "Those two really love each other, don't they?" I said. Mr. Wilkin nodded. "Aye, they are great friends. They are never apart." Mr. Wilkin was a busy man with many cows, pigs, and sheep to look after, but he still had time for his favorite hobby, breeding and training sheepdogs. For many years he had won silver cups all over the country. From the latest litter he had picked the best two pups, Jip and Sweep, and he was going to train them to run in the sheepdog trials. The two little animals were rolling around in a happy wrestling match, growling and panting, chewing gently at each other's legs. Then suddenly they stopped playing as something else caught their attention. "Look at that!" I cried in amazement. They were behaving like grown-up dogs. The pups were beginning to round up a group of tiny ducklings, much to the annoyance of the mother duck. With noses outstretched and stomachs nearly flat on the cobblestones of the farmyard, they crept up on the ducklings. "Yes," the farmer replied. "They are only 12 weeks old, but their mother and father, their grandmothers and grandfathers, and away back, as long as I can remember, were all sheepdogs. So these little things were born wanting to round up chickens, ducks, lambs, anything they see. The two doggy friends were different in appearance. Sweep was black and white, while Jip was black, white, and brown. But the thing you noticed most was that one of Jip's ears stuck up, while the other ear lay flat against his head. This gave him a funny, lopsided look. In fact, he looked a bit like a clown, but he was a friendly, tail-wagging clown. "There's one odd thing about Jip," Mr. Wilkin said. "He's never barked at all." I looked at him in surprise. "You mean never, ever?" "That's right, not a single bark. The other dogs make a noise when strangers come to the farm, but I've never heard Jip make a sound since he was born." I shook my head. How very strange. I've never heard of such a thing. I got into my car, and as I drove away, I noticed that while Sweep and the other two farm dogs barked their farewells loudly, Jip merely wagged his tail and looked at me in a friendly manner, his pink tongue lolling out of his open mouth. A silent dog. Some months later, just before Christmas, George Crossley, one of Mr. Wilkin's oldest friends and a very keen sheepdog trainer, came to ask if he could buy a dog as his own old dog had died. Mr. Wilkin sold Sweep to him. I was a bit surprised about this because I knew that Sweep was further forward in his training than Jip and looked like turning into a real champion. But it was Jip he kept. Perhaps it was because he just liked him. He was a funny dog with that lopsided charm that was difficult to resist. Jip must have been sad to lose his brother and best friend, and there was no doubt that he missed him. But there were other dogs on the farm, and even if they didn't make up for Sweep, he was never really lonely. Although Jip grew up big and strong, he wasn't quite clever enough to compete in the trials. So he just helped Mr. Wilkin by herding the sheep and cattle on the farm. He was very happy to be out with his master all day, but perhaps he wondered where his old doggy friend had gone. It wasn't until the following June that I next visited the farm to see a sick cow, and I saw Jip, now fully grown, riding along on a hay cart. I spotted him again at harvest time, chasing rats among the stooks. He was always glad to see me, full of fun, bright-eyed, and affectionate, but soundless. There was a very long spell when none of Mr. Wilkin's animals needed my help, and I did not see him or Jip until I met them both at a sheepdog trial the following summer. The huge field where the trial was being held was on the river's edge, and the sunshine glinted on the water. The cars were drawn up along the side of the field, and groups of men, mainly competitors, stood around chatting as they watched the dogs working with the sheep. They were dressed in all sorts of clothing: cloth caps, deerstalkers, or sometimes no hat at all, tweed jackets, best suits, open-neck shirts, fancy ties, and sometimes neither collar nor tie. Nearly all of them leaned on long crooks with the handles carved from ram's horns. Their dogs, waiting their turn, were tied to the fence, and it was wonderful to see the long row of waving tails and friendly expressions. Few of the dogs knew each other, but there was not a single growl, never mind a fight. I went over to Mr. Wilkin, who was leaning against his car, which was parked within sight of the final pen. Jip was tied to the bumper and was watching with interest as each dog took its turn. Mrs. Wilkin was sitting on a camp stool by his side. "Are you running a dog today, Mr. Wilkin?" I asked. "No, not this time. I've just come to watch," he replied. I had been there for about 10 minutes when suddenly the farmer lifted a pointing finger. "Look who's there!" George Crossley with Sweep was making their way to the starting post. Jip suddenly stiffened and sat up very straight, one ear cocked to the side, the other flat, making him look more lopsided than ever. It was over a year since he had seen his brother, and it seemed unlikely, I thought, that he would remember him. But he was obviously very interested, and as the judge waved his white handkerchief to begin the trial and the 3 sheep were released from the far corner of the field, Jip rose slowly to his feet. A gesture from Mr. Crossley sent Sweep racing round to the edge of the field in a wide, joyous gallop, and as they neared the sheep, a whistle from Mr. Crossley made him drop onto his stomach. From then on, it was easy to see that Sweep was going to be a champion, as he darted and crouched at his master's commands. Short whistles, long whistles, Sweep understood them all. No other dog all day had brought his sheep through the 3 pairs of gates as easily as Sweep did now, and as he neared the final pen, it was obvious he was going to win, unless the sheep scattered at the last moment. George crossly opened the gate wide and held out his crook. I could hardly hear his commands to Sweep, but his quiet words brought the dog wriggling inch by inch over the grass towards the sheep. Were they going to go bounding away and spoil everything? I held my breath. But no, after hesitating and looking around a few times, the sheep turned and entered the pen, and Mr. Crossley banged the gate behind them. As he did so, he turned to Sweep with a happy cry of, "Good lad!" and the dog answered with a quick wag of his tail. At that, Jip, who had been standing very still, watching every move intently, raised his head and gave a single loud bark, which echoed round the field. "Are you going to bark?" "Woof!" How was that? Went Jip, and we all stared at him in astonishment. "Did you hear that?" gasped Mrs. Wilkin. "Well, I don't believe it," her husband burst out, looking open-mouthed at the dog. Jip didn't seem to realize he had done anything unusual. George Crossley came over with Sweep, and the 2 dogs greeted each other happily. Mr. Wilkin let Jip off his lead, and within seconds the 2 dogs were rolling around, chewing playfully at each other as they used to do as pups. I suppose the Wilkins, as well as myself, had the feeling that this event might encourage Jip to bark like any other dog, but it was not to be. 6 years later, I was at the farm and went to the house to get some hot water. As Mrs. Wilkin handed me the bucket, she looked down at Jip, who was basking in the sunshine outside the kitchen door. "There you are, you funny fellow," she said to the dog. I laughed. "Has he ever barked since that day?" Mrs. Wilkin shook her head. "No, he hasn't, not a sound. I waited a long time, but I don't think he'll ever bark." "Oh, well, it's not important. But I'll never forget that afternoon at the trial," I said. "Nor will I." Mrs. Wilkin looked at Jip again. She smiled as she remembered. "Poor old lad. 8 years old and only one wolf." And that's the ending. Again, the book is Only One Woof by James Herriot, and you should definitely check out his books if you love animals because they're really fun stories. Okay, so our last book for today is going to be The English Roses by Madonna. I definitely recommend checking this book out because the illustrations are some of the best I've ever seen in a picture book. They're just really, really wonderful. And there's actually a chapter book series now, too, of The English Roses, and that's wonderful, too. So, The English Roses. Have you ever heard of the English Roses? Here's what they are not. A box of chocolates, a football team, flowers growing in the garden. What they are is this: 4 little girls named Nicole, Amy, Charlotte, and Grace. Here are some things you should know about them. They go to the same school and live in the same neighborhood. They play the same games, read the same books, and like the same boys. They have picnics in the summer and ice skating parties in the winter. They are practically glued to each other at the hip. Most of all, they love to dance. And here's a picture of all of them doing all these different dances throughout history, which is really fun. It all sounds so perfectly fun and nice, and in many ways it was. But there was only one problem. They were all a little bit jealous of another girl who lived in the neighborhood. Her name was Biana, and here are some things you should know about her. She was very, very beautiful. She had long, silky hair and skin like milk and honey. She was an excellent student and very good at sports. She was always kind to people. She was special. But she was sad, because even though she was the most beautiful girl anyone had ever seen, she was also very lonely. She had no friends, and wherever she went, she was alone. By now, you are probably wondering, what's the big deal? If she was so nice, why didn't the English Roses invite her over for a cup of tea? Listen, I already told you why. Because they were a little jealous. Well, maybe more than a little. Haven't you ever been green with envy, or felt like you were about to explode if you didn't get what somebody else had? If you say no, you are telling a big fat fib, and I'm going to tell your mother. Now stop interrupting me. You see, the English Roses wanted to be friendly, but they knew that Biana was lonely. But they could not bring themselves to be nice to her, because everywhere they went, this is what they heard. What a beauty she is. She shines like a star. That Biana is something else. When Nicole and Amy and Charlotte and Grace heard people speak this way about Biana, they always felt like they were going to be sick. This is what they would say. How could anyone be so perfect? No one ever says that about us. It's not fair to have so much. Let's pretend we don't see her when she walks by. Let's push her into the lake. And that is what they did. No, silly, not the lake part. The pretending not to see her part. And so time went on, and the English Roses continued to have fun with each other, and Biana remained alone. One night, when all the girls were having a sleepover party at Nicole's house, her mother peeked her head around the corner and said, "Do you mind if I come in here and have a chat with all of you?" "Don't worry, Mom, we're going to bed soon," said Nicole. "Just let us finish our pillow fight." "That's not why I came in here," her mother replied. "I wanted to talk to you about Biana. She lives down the street, she goes to your school, she likes to do all the same things you like to do, and yet you never invite her over or make any effort to be friendly with her." There was a very long pause. The English Roses looked around the room at one another. Amy was the first to speak. "She thinks she's God's gift to creation just because she's beautiful. Yes, why should we invite her over? She gets enough attention already," Charlotte joined in. "It's not that we don't like her," said Nicole. "It's just that she's probably stuck up. Pretty girls usually are." Nicole's mother thought about this for a moment, and then she said, "I think you girls are being unfair. She looks like she could really use a friend, and you haven't even had a conversation with her. How do you know what kind of a person she is? How would you like it if people decided whether they were going to be nice to you based on how you look?" The girls knew she had a point, but they didn't want to say it. Suddenly they didn't feel like having a pillow fight. "Please think about what I've said," said Nicole's mother, and she stood up and kissed them all goodnight. When her mother was gone, Nicole turned out the light, and the girls lay awake in the dark for a while thinking about what Nicole's mother had said. No one said a word, and eventually they all fell fast asleep. And while they were sleeping, they each had the same exact dream. Here's what they dreamed. All four of them were having a picnic in the park, complaining, as usual, about how beautiful Biana was, how she got too much attention, and how unfair it was for them, when suddenly a fairy godmother appeared. She was short and plump and very jolly looking. Listen, why am I telling you this? Don't you even know what a fairy godmother looks like? Anyway, she landed right on top of Charlotte's sandwich. "Oh, excuse me, is that pumpernickel bread?" she said, sniffing the air. "I just love the smell of pumpernickel." The girls sat and stared at her with their mouths open because they'd never seen a fairy godmother before. "Ahem," said the fairy godmother, clearing her throat. "Now, where was I? Oh, yes. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. It sounds like you are all quite dissatisfied with who you are, which makes me very unhappy, and I would like to offer you the opportunity to be someone else." "What do you mean?" asked Charlotte, pulling her sandwich out from underneath the fairy godmother's bottom. "What I mean," replied the fairy, "and please do not interrupt me, is if you are so jealous of Biana, then by all means you should be someone else. In fact, perhaps one of you would even like to trade places with Biana." "Oh, that's silly. How can we possibly be someone else?" interrupted Grace. "Well, if you would just let me finish," harumphed the fairy. "When I sprinkle my magic dust over you, you can be whoever you'd like to be. But first you might want to fly over to Biana's house with me and spend some time with her, just to make sure that her life is to your liking, or anyone else's for that matter." The girls all gulped and nodded, and finally Nicole said, But, she'll see us looking through the window and she'll think we're burglars or something." "Yes, she might call the police," added Amy. "Oh, nonsense," scoffed the fairy, nibbling on Charlotte's chocolate chip cookie. "When I sprinkle you with magic fairy dust, you will be invisible. and you can go wherever you want to go. No one will ever see you." The girls just sat there speechless, which didn't happen very often, I can assure you. "Well, don't just sit there stuffing your faces," tutted the fairy, stuffing her face. "My time is very valuable." The girls leaned forward and whispered quietly for a moment. They decided that even though the fairy took their cookies without asking, she seemed rather harmless. And anyway, they couldn't turn down the chance to spy on Biana without her knowing they were there. So they asked to be sprinkled with fairy dust, and off they flew to Biana's house. Suddenly, they found themselves sitting around Biana's kitchen table, and there, on her hands and knees, was Biana, scrubbing the floor. Sweat was dripping from her forehead, and she looked very tired. All at once, her father came into the room and said, "It's getting late, Biana. When you finish scrubbing the floor, I think you should start cooking dinner. I'm going outside to fix the car." Biana smiled and said, "Okay, Papa." Then he was gone. Biana proceeded to do a multitude of tasks. When she finished cleaning the floor, she peeled potatoes, she chopped onions, and set the table. She scaled the fish, she washed and ironed the clothes, and finally she emptied the trash. The English Roses couldn't believe their eyes. They had never seen a girl work so hard in their lives. "She reminds me of Cinderella," said Amy. "She looks like she hasn't combed her hair in a week," remarked Charlotte. "Where is her mother?" asked Nicole. "She doesn't have a mother," replied the fairy godmother. "She lives alone with her father, and he works all day. So when she comes home from school, she has to clean the house and wash the clothes and cook the dinner." "You mean she does it all by herself?" asked Grace. "Yes, you ninnies," answered the fairy. "I just said she lives alone with her father." "Well, what happened to her mother?" asked Nicole. "She died a very long time ago. Poor thing," sighed the fairy. "And as you know, Biana has no friends, so she spends all her time on her own." "Well, come along then, girls. Would you like to see what her bedroom looks like?" The English Roses all stood up to go, but they felt bad about leaving Biana behind all by herself with so much work to do. "Oh, don't dawdle, ladies. I've got places to go and people to meet," said the fairy impatiently. So they went off to see if Biana's room was to their liking. They were not prepared for what they saw. A simple room with a single bed, a chest of drawers, a shelf full of books. There was, of course, one doll, but only one. Can you believe it? Well, you better, because I'm telling you. There was one picture in a frame on the bedside table, and all the girls gathered around to see who was in the picture. It was a beautiful photograph of Biana's mother. Nicole's eyes began to fill with tears. "I feel so bad," she said. "It must be awful not to have a mother." "She must feel terribly lonely," said Charlotte, "and we haven't been very nice to her." "Well, what do you say?" interrupted the fairy godmother. "Anyone want to trade places?" There was a very long pause. The English Roses looked at one another. It was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "I think we've made a terrible mistake," said Grace. "I can't imagine living without my mum." "I don't want to do so many chores," said Amy, "and I don't know the first thing about cooking." "Well, is there anyone else you'd like to be?" asked the fairy godmother. "Perhaps in another neighborhood, another city, or even another country. I'm sure I could arrange it for you." "Please, just let us go home to our own cozy beds and our families, who we love," begged Nicole. "Yes, we want to go home," cried the rest of the girls. "Suit yourself," said the fairy, "but in the future, you might think twice before grumbling that someone else has a better life than you. And as I said before, I'm a very busy woman." In the blink of an eye, the English Roses were back in bed, fast asleep. When morning came, the girls awoke, relieved to find that they were still themselves. They told one another about their dream, and they promised each other that from that day on they would be kinder to Biana and stop complaining about their own lives. First, they invited Biana to a tea party, and then they started walking to school with her, and not long after that, they were doing homework together. Biana even taught them how to bake an apple pie. They soon found out that she was very likable indeed. They grew to love her like a sister and often went to her house to help her with her chores. Time went by, and soon, everywhere the English Roses went, Biana went with them. And you're not going to believe this, but people in the neighborhood started talking about them. And this is what they said. Those English roses are really special. What beautiful girls. They'll grow up to be incredible women one day. And you know what? They did. And if you don't believe me, then go and find out for yourself. I didn't make this up. The end. So again, if you guys enjoyed this book, this was The English Roses by Madonna. And there's also a sequel and a whole chapter book series. And the illustrations are amazing. So feel free to go check them out. So that was all for today. So we'll read to you guys another time, okay? Bye!